Welcome to the Stone Carvers Guild podcast. Here you will meet a variety of carvers working throughout North America. Drawing on our collective experience, we seek to share knowledge about this ancient art and to do our part to ensure that stone carving will play an important role in built environments for generations to come. So whether you are an experienced carver, new to the craft, or just curious, put on your safety goggles, open up your mind, and welcome to the workshop.
One of the things we were going to plan is how to start the show. Have we figured that out yet?
Well, we were thinking that the guests would sing us a song to start off with that encapsulates their stone carving experience.
All right, Stephen.
I mean, Dale Johnson gave us music, so...
Yeah, take it away.
Well, I don't know. And told if you never slow down, you never grow old.
That's really good.
This is better than I dreamed. I got to tell you, that really worked out.
Yes. So, Stephen, you're in California?
Yeah, I'm. My studio's in Rio Linda. It's a little ways outside of Sacramento, capital, sort of Northern California area. I'd call it basically east of San Francisco.
Okay. Wow, they have rocks out there? I don't think of California as having any carvable rocks.
Well, carvable's that's a broad term. So they were suckers for punishment out here, and we had this area. I'm kind of in a weird way the last offshoot of an extremely broad and grand past of granite quarrying operations, carving, cutting. The rock quarry's not far from me. At one point, there was several dozen quarries, thousands of stone cutters, hundreds of carvers in there, and they produced everything from the foundations for the Golden Gate Bridge to San Francisco City Hall, the state capitol. The largest stone that we're putting out here, even still to this day, is granite. We got Sierra White and Academy Black are our two generic black and white speckled sort of granites. But we do also have marble and sandstone that was out here quite a bit. Stanford University, for instance, is sort of like a buff tan colored sandstone that came from the McGillivray quarry, I think. And we have Calusa sandstone that's kind of a green color. And you could still get Santa Barbara sandstone that's also sort of a tan buff color down in Southern California. None of our marble quarries are active anymore. You can get chunks of it from various rock yards here and there. There is the Columbia Marble Quarry is still open, but they're basically just extracting it for farming purposes. They just, crush it up and amend it into the soils for all the different greenbelt stuff that we have going on around here too.
Wow.
So there's a ton of stone, but we also have, unfortunately, extreme measures against mining out here. The environmentalists have, across the board, whether it's your tailpipes in your car or, environmental restrictions for mining, they really have kind of cramped down on it quite a bit. I know they were just trying to open a gold mine back up in Nevada City. I can't quite remember which one it was, but the city planners there just recently rejected that one, mostly because of, they're concerned about the toxicity of the water that gets put out from that. But
wow.
But yeah, there of course is another resource that we have tons of up here is gold.
Famously so.
Yeah, it's one of the. Not far from here is where it was discovered, up there in Placerville and sort of close to Hangtown. And there's a mill here in Sacramento that's Sutter's Fort that actually was John Sutter's Fort, the guy that was here when it was just a cow pasture, basically. And there was his fort, and the Spanish had that presence, and that was about it. And then a couple years later, Sacramento was here. It went pretty fast, from what I understand.
Wow.
So Stephen, how do you introduce yourself when somebody says, "Who are you?"
Oh man. In the context of just as a person or a carver or
Across the board, you decide.
I that's a good question. I think that's evolving for all of us. I like to think that I discover myself every day a little bit more. And the basic idea is I've spent the last, couple decades plus of my life pursuing this path as a stone carver. I love auto mechanics and fast cars. I'm a dad, and I have an adult son now, and so I have that aspect to my life. I love yoga, exercise. I love getting outdoors and just seeing our natural environment, meditation, and art. Art to me has always been kind of like an outlet for me to just sometimes breathe just a little bit and to try to let go of whatever anxieties or outside pressures that I've felt over the years.
Yeah. So how did you get into the stone carving?
That was an intuitive process for me, and that comes across in a lot of things that I end up doing, and it actually ties in with my family because I was a teenage dad. I was 18, 19 years old when I was making a family. I met a woman. She had a young daughter already, and we fell in love and started a family. And at 18 and 19 years old, fresh out of high school, with a family, you have to figure out a way to support that. How do you feed them, and how do you pay the bills? And so I was working in construction, kind of at that point, and even at that stage, I kind of had this mantra that perked its way back up in masonry later, actually, for trying to live some sort of a balanced life. Because I'm both an operative and a speculative mason. I'm a Freemason here at Rio Linda 786, and I'm also like an official member of Eugene 11 up in Oregon. Although that's more of a token. I as far as physically being there, I don't do that often because it's so far away. But we have 24 hours in the day. And I figured at that point in my life, without knowing what path to take, that I was going to be asleep for 8 of those. So that gave me about 16 hours, and I was supposed to work for 8 hours. That's half my life. Half my life. I need to do something with that. And I just figured I wanted to enjoy it somehow. I wanted to find something that I liked and that resonated with me. And I was working at a construction company, tearing apart old burned buildings. We would go in and demolish them. And, I was a hard worker. And this guy pulls up one day and he wants help setting tile. And I said, hey, can you come help mix my mud on this weekend as a side job? And I said, yeah, I got lots of mouths to feed. I want to make some money. I need to work. And so I just fell in love with it. I got there and the mud and the process and cutting the pieces of tile, it was just, everything just felt kind of amazing for some reason. And I basically immediately searched for a job trying to do that. Cause I sort of had just this epiphany moment where this feels right. I wasn't that great of a carpenter. I always struggled to hit a nail right. But for some reason, this all made sense to me. And I got into that. I was doing that for, like a half a year or something. And that same guy came back later and said, hey, I'm working at this slab yard doing marble masonry. And they did countertops and stuff. And I need an assistance helper. And, at that point we had started becoming friends, and he brought me these pieces of granite. I think it's this greenstone called Ubatuba. And, I was practicing polishing it in his garage, and it was just the neatest thing ever to see these pieces of stone go from like this rough cut edge to a polished edge. And so I got my initial path forward was in those marble masonry yards, doing countertops, doing flat work. And it just seemed to me, when I looked around, when I saw all these old buildings, I saw, something that I loved, but it was almost, it's three-dimensional. It's going off in all kinds of different directions. Some of this stuff looks beautiful and amazing. And I started grabbing rocks and trying to carve them and trying to figure out how to do this. And I just kept looking around, and I said, well, I see these buildings. Who's doing that? And it took me a while to figure it out, but there was one guy here in town named Gene Chapman, and I contacted him. And at that point, I had a small portfolio of little pieces that I'd carved just kind of on my own without knowing what to do, mostly with a grinder and a polisher and trying to chisel things if I could. And Gene was a stone cutter. He had worked in one of the last remaining quarries here in Rockland, and later had purchased and worked under a monument maker. And he worked primarily in granite and had a monument shop there that had been there for 3 or 4 generations of people by the time he had it. And I had an interview with him, and he kind of took me under his wing and said, I can start you off a couple days a week. And it just grew from there. I got experience working for him kind of as my initial apprenticeship. And from there, it bounced around a little bit. I had periods where.
When was that? Like how old were you by then?
Oh, I was still only, I was 20.
Okay, so all of that happened in pretty tight little window.
It was
years.
When you're 18 or 19, 2 months seems like a long time. But,
right.
It was pretty fast.
And so that's when you started the cutting, and that was like you were about 20.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you use the phrase operative and speculative mason, is that? I've never heard those phrases. What does that mean?
Well, so we're operative masons. So we are, doing the physical craft. We're operating our craft in the physical sense of it. We're taking stones, cutting them, hewing them, carving them, fitting them, making them to fit well with each other for the edifice as a whole, based upon the plans and structures and information that we're getting. We're taking the esoteric craft, but doing it in the physical realm.
Right.
And then the speculative masons are only doing it in the esoteric idea of it. They're not actually holding a chisel. Probably don't even know how half the time.
So, like, I don't understand who a speculative mason is. So you mean they're operating like CNC machines, or what? What
No,
are they?
So Freemasonry at one point in around the 1700s started allowing in people that weren't stonecutters into their craft guilds at that point for whatever reason, and gradually now it's to the point where if you go to a Masonic lodge, there's probably almost nobody in there that is actually, a real
Mason. Yeah.
I know, like our guild, for instance, we have had other members that have been, from the Masonic tradition. One of our founders, I'm trying to remember his name right now, but it's kind of escaping me at the moment. But there had been a foundation even here where some of us were that way. And here in the mountains, even coincidentally, here as recently as like the turn of the last century, there's the Griffith Quarry, and those guys, same thing, had been operative and speculative. But it basically, what you do is try to imagine it like this: instead of actually cutting and carving any stone, you're just taking the ideas of, how to be persistent. How do you, working 700 hours on a piece of rock and having the stamina mentally, physically, and emotionally to hang in there with that, to not make a mistake, to have that concentration through that process across months, across years at some points, is daunting. And building in stone has in the past sometimes taken even hundreds of years across generations. So you take that, you take the geometries, you take the mathematics and all of those things that are impacting us from our built environment, from our world, and you're using that in a way that is more of an idea than an actual physical practice, I think.
Well, I didn't mean to interrupt you. So you're 20 years old, and are you working with the hammer and chisel right away, or?
Yeah. Gene he had his background in the quarries, and he was using black powder and splitting block out of the ground in the Rockland Quarry, and working with wire saws and carving big stones. He had these giant blocks of granite, and that for this project that he was carving called the Guardian, and one of these things was probably 10 tons. It was just these massive, huge pieces of Dakota mahogany. And he's the one that he taught me how to split granite. He got me involved with the air bottle and the bushing tools and the flat tools and the carving and sandblasting operations and lettering, engraving, how you start to approach this stuff. We produced monuments at that shop as a practical application, but every week as part of my training, there was one day that he called Art Day. And basically that was, he gave us, me and the other guy that was there, he gave us blocks of stone, and that was what we were supposed to be doing, was using 20% of our time to educate ourselves.
Wow, that's really forward thinking. That's great.
Yeah.
Well, and so that's that was the first shop where I actually had pneumatic tools in my hands, and I started using carving tools, and I was able to watch somebody actually approach a piece of stone that's the size of a truck. And how do you start cutting into this thing? How do you lay this thing out? Moving it with Lewis pins and a crane. I mean, that was like magic to me, when you drill in 35-degree angle and somehow this thing doesn't fall down.
Right.
It was just the most fascinating. I was in dreamland at that point. That was like a wish come true. I knew I was in the right place.
How long did you stay there?
I worked with him across 4 years for probably 2 years. There was some periods in between where he didn't have work, and I went back to the marble masonry yards, and then he would have more work, and I would, cut back in there and assist him some more. And I never stopped working on my own, even through that whole time period, regardless of whatever job that I was working on. I ended up in between. I was working at these various slab yards, and I would either bring in dimensional pieces of stone, or, one of them actually they were producing mostly like sills and thresholds and kind of simple items for houses, nothing really that dramatic, but they had pieces of Texas limestone there. And so you could grab offcuts here and there and kind of play around with it. And I kind of went through that process for, I don't know, a handful of years, give or take, kind of going back and forth, working on my own. Um, I continued to try to develop my artistic side. I found a sculptor here in town, the Romo family. They're reasonably well known here. They've produced large scale bronzes and some works in marble, and I got some training from them, just kind of hanging around in people's studios. And eventually, um, I discovered there was a guild at that point, and I, being I never lost my desire for trying to obtain this knowledge. I knew there was more. And so, regardless of how my path flopped around a little bit, I kept trying to find something. And through the guild, I ended up, I found a guy named Oleg Lobikin, and he wasn't that far from me. And I ended up working for him too. Actually, at that point, I was basically like a journeyman stonecutter, and we did a lot of restoration stuff here in the Presidio of San Francisco and at Stanford, where we'd tear things apart and put them back together. But he also gave me some practical information, like how to use a pointing machine for copying sculpture and restoration works and cleaning and patching and sculpting of older elements and cutting and carving of stones. From there, I would say the next phase was when I had worked for Nathan Hunt over their studios. And that was really where I got my sort of final, my traineeship in carving. After I had gone through all the cutting and learned most of the basics across the years of cutting and carving, getting in there with those guys for, it was like a year and a half or so, where we went in and we carved the Santa Barbara courthouse fountain, and there was larger elements. There was like a tympanum and a kneeler with a griffin and a lot of acanthus work and really fine carving over there that we were working on in sandstone and limestone.
What kind of sandstone? Was it local sandstone and limestone, or?
It was interesting brownstone. From Canada, I believe. Brownstone's really rare in this northern North America area here now. We used to have some here, and I know in New York that some of the quarries are running dry over there at this point, but there had still been a place in Canada putting some of that stuff out. I think you can get some variety of it from Utah. Has some color that looks pretty close to it, but
does it hold together as well? Because I know, like with some sandstones, seem to almost dissolve fairly quickly in the weather.
It does not weather well.
Oh, okay, yeah.
No, that one had a lot of clay in it for sure.
Well, it starts to abrade itself. Like that's the thing with sandstone, is like once the water starts flowing, it's kind of like game over.
There's I ended up working in Australia for a couple of years, and there's a ton of sandstone over there. And what I can tell you I learned from that stuff is there seems to be kind of two different binding agents for these sandstones. One of them's kaolin, which is a clay, and that one's water soluble. So you put it outside, and in 100 years, it's like a pile of mush.
Mm-hmm.
And the other one has more iron and magnesium in it, depending on which one it is. And that one will weather, reasonable. None of them are like granite or, even some limestones, but you do have to bed them correctly. You can't have the grain going some strange direction. They a lot of similar properties to limestone, but yeah, that particular brownstone, you would even come across small chunks of this sort of brownish clay, and it was really soft in that respect. It does case harden after a while. If you leave it outside, the surface of it will get harder, but it takes some time.
Do you know the science of that? Like I know I know of that phenomenon, but I don't know why.
I do. So So here's the thing: is that all of it's somewhat water soluble, even the quartz, to a smaller extent. And so what happens is they get saturated, these stones, with water, and eventually the water evaporates back out of them. And when it does that, it's dissolved some of the minerals in these stones, right? And it pulls them to the surface because the water's in this evaporative process is going to the surface. But when it gets there, the minerals are solid and can't turn to vapor. So instead of traveling further with the water vapor into the atmosphere, they get deposited in that crust area right on the eighth.
That is so interesting. So it fills in the gaps.
Yeah.
In a way, and just over time, like there's just fewer and fewer gaps for water to penetrate.
If it works right, I mean,
right.
The danger there is if the pointing's wrong, if it's not allowed to breathe properly, there's a bunch of variables where that can also trap it and start coming off later. If you get salt air, I've seen that before too, where it will hit that layer and crystallize behind it.
Right. Or it can start spalling if it traps, you get the frozen water behind it.
Yeah. But you get the right stone in the right area and they will do okay usually. I found a lot of times that the local stone likes its local area pretty well.
That's right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've heard an architect talk about how not only aesthetically or local materials, they just fit with the environment, but also, with as far as like weathering and aging, that local materials are always the way to go. I always get concerned when someone is like saying they want a Cordova cream, which is Texas's limestone. You want that Texas limestone up in Minnesota, and it's like, nah, you don't want that.
Why not?
Because it won't age well at all. The weather up there is so much different than, the Texas just weather systems,
I was hoping for a Minnesota joke since Bethany's from Minnesota. There, so. Speaking of local and keeping stone local, Stephen, sounds like you've stayed pretty well central to that area. Is that right?
I ended up back here. My path, it took me from, I started off here. I was born in Sacramento. In the 08 housing crash, that was kind of especially when I had to start wandering around for work. And that brought me to San Francisco because there was plenty of work going on there and the dimensional aspect. And so San Francisco and that more the Oleg and Nathan Hunt period, but that also brought me down south into Southern California for 6 months or so. But from there, I did spend the next 2 years over in Australia. I went over there. I worked on Parliament House in Brisbane. I worked on St. Mary's Cathedral in Ipswich, and I worked on St. Joseph's Cathedral up in Rockhampton. The longest period was the one in Rockhampton for probably about a year and a half. I was up there on that cathedral, and that one was pretty extensive. There was fencing going around it. I personally constructed the front steps and actually cut probably 10 or so of the treads myself. Obviously, there was a crew of like 20 of us working on this thing, so I wasn't by myself building a cathedral, but there's a portrait of a priest on the inside that I carved on a termination stamp in the nave. And there was on one of the compound piers going up at the crossing so the crossing is where you have the transepts that come off of the nave of the cathedral. And, you picture like the human body, because that's basically what a cathedral emulates is, the head is the ambulatory at the end, with the feet being the entrance of the cathedral. And the two transepts are the arms that come off to the sides, and that cross where they intersect can be quite large, right? And so you need big compound piers to hold these things together. And the building moved around at one point from the old to the new because the ambulatory at the back had been constructed separately, and it sheared one of these capitals in half. And so I got to carve a huge section of that thing, which was fun. And so I was over there for quite a while. And then after that, I came back here to San Francisco. So when I left Australia, I was about 30 years old at this stage. So I had spent 10 years trying to find training, getting apprenticeship, getting traineeship, traveling for a couple of years. And one of the best guys I'd ever worked with was this carver from England. His name's Andrian Melka. He is phenomenal. To this day, I still stand by the fact that guy is amazing. He carved Princess Diana's death urn. I mean, this guy, he's just absolutely phenomenal. He's Albanian, and when he was in communist Albania, they would choose your occupation kind of when you were like 13 years old. If you had talents, they just pretty much were like, okay, that's what you're doing. And they would stick you into that. And so he got kind of like, he was talented at art, and they developed him into a sculptor. He fled there for, safety reasons. And that's why he's in England. But he had the academic training too. And so I said, okay, if I'm going to do it, I'm 30 years old now. I can't wait any longer. I either need to go and get my sculpture degree now, or I'm just not going to do it. And so I went for it, and I came back here. At that point, Nathan Hunt, he needed somebody to manage his Northern California location. So I came up here, and I was foreman at his carving studio. I managed those operations for about 5 years. And at the same time, I was going to school full time at the Academy of Art University and getting my degree in fine art sculpture. I got my bachelor's degree from there. And once I finished that, somewhere around 7 years ago at this point, I finally made my way back here and kind of established my studio and, moved back. By this point, I had wandered around a lot, and I was always a good dad. I was always paying the bills. I visited often. I came back as often as I could. I lived on the road for a long time. I slept in couches. I slept in shops. I slept in a lot of hotels and hostels. I'd never really had a stable home for a long, long time there, trying to just go on this path. And, I at this stage, I thought I could go anywhere, but I want to be around my son if I can.
Mm-hmm.
So I made my way back here, and I've been kind of just here ever since at this stage. It's in the scheme of things, there's 3 stages to life, they say. There's in masonry, there's the growth, the use, and the reflection. And so that was the transition for me from the growth phase to the use phase, which is where I'm at now. And so yeah, now I've been back here. I got my studio set up, and for whatever reason, I just have been getting requests for commissions over these past 7 years for all varieties of different interesting projects at this stage.
That's funny. That's the way every commission feels to me. It's like, why is this happening? It's like sometimes it's like a miracle. It's like just as you see your account go from 3 digits to 2 digits, you're like, suddenly you get a phone call. It's like, thank you.
I've been hanging on by a thread at some points, and
absolutely
something comes along, and it seems like it's feast or famine at points.
Sure.
for sure. But in the earlier phases, I used to get really concerned about where the next thing was going to come from. And it's taken a while for me to finally become comfortable with the idea that something will materialize. And I put behind that and networking and everything else. But if you do good work, you get more work, was what I was taught when I was an apprentice. And I have found that to be true.
Yeah, it's interesting. I found myself in the last 5 years, just kind of like finally relaxing into the idea of like, well, it's worked out for it's worked out up till now. I should, when it seems like when it seems scary, it's like, well, things kind of seem to work out. So, once you get to that point, you can kind of enjoy that time, that downtime a little bit, and do some of the stuff that you wanted to do, that you don't have time for when you're in the middle of a huge project.
There's a lot of little personal projects, business development, all that stuff. Like even just taking photos of our work,
right?
I mean, that's a task, right? And it's like, okay, that's, that needs to, sometimes I have to that's a whole day trip. Like I gotta drive 200 miles for the day to go to different places trying to just snap some good photos. And I try to do that when I'm at these locations if I can, but a lot of times there's other construction going on and it's not like a finished presentable photo anyways, even if I did take one. It's like
right.
Everything, the hardscape has to go in, or the landscaping's not there, or there's so many other parts of it that aren't actually finished, or the lighting's poor. That's a big part of it. You can take a photo, but morning to evening, the piece is going to look different.
That's right. Yeah, sometimes you got to all day. You got to wait for the sun to get right. Your website's really cool. That's what I was just thinking about. Like one of the things I need to do is revamp my website. But I really like yours. It's very straightforward, and you just scroll through the photos easily. I'm looking at one photograph of a baby in some hands. Is that your studio?
That was Hunt Studios.
Oh, okay.
But that's my carving. Basically, there's a Catholic church in Central California that had this block of that's Tennessee pink marble, Tennessee light rose, they would call it. It's a really good stone. It's a hard marble. I mean, it's like Carrara marble, but a little bit harder. It carves pretty sharp. It's maybe not quite as fine grain as Carrara, but you can get good details out of it. And somebody else had tried to carve that thing, and it was so bad that they basically pulled it from that sculptor, and were at this point in a panic going, this thing, we need to find somebody else. And so they contacted Nathan, and because it was a religious piece, basically that's a monument for aborted children. And I don't know. I think my take on sculpture in a lot of ways is I was less concerned about whatever my own opinion could be or not be about that. And I see the art and I see the opportunity for that. And actually, to me, when I was always making monuments, it was always the children that my heart was most empathetic for, regardless. The children and the suicides, those were always the toughest. I had to go home a few times for, there's one gal when I was making a monument. I couldn't even, it took me a couple days just to draw the letters. But at some stage, being a professional, you have to look at it as I'm here to do a job. And that's what I'm going to do. And I'm a sculptor, I'm qualified, and I'm a stone carver. And here I am to be able to produce this work. And they had they had some images that they liked that had produced this concept of this baby being cradled by the hands, and so I went in and I reworked the whole thing. The toughest part about that is because the guy had already worked the block before me, that there just was limitations. I mean, things had been established as far as placement to some degree. I was able to push things back, push things down, move things around. I turned the head some. There was still material behind things, so I could work it backwards a little bit and get this thing looking. I thought that thing turned out really nice. I was really proud of that. It's quite large, really. I think it's like 30 inches wide or something. So it's a fairly imposing looking sculpture as far as, when it's on its pedestal and you're there and it's interacting with your environment. But I love figurative work. For me, that was always part of sculpting. And even when I was in the beginning, I had this epiphany at Gene's workshop when I was an apprentice that I wanted to carve a life-size figure in marble. I was in the shop one day and the sun was shining through sort of the clerestory windows that were up there at the top. And this isn't healthy, but there's like glittering stone dust in the air, so it looks romantic. And there's blocks. I'm surrounded by these giant blocks of stone, and some of the tools in there are century old. And it just came to me that I want to carve a life-size figure in marble. And part of that baby in the hands was that whole period where I was getting my fine arts degree. And one of the reasons I chose the academy was because the sculpture program over there was classically based, not conceptual, technical skill. You learned a lot of anatomy. I mean, a lot of classes with just structural anatomy, studying from life, figure drawing, painting, drawing, and sculpture all together. And so I got pretty good with the anatomy. I mean, I even won an award one year for my écorché, which is where you sculpt all the muscles you sculpt all the bones, you sculpt all the muscles, and you layer them on there. Like half the thing is muscles, half the thing is bones, but you're learning all the insertion points, you're learning the locations, the proportions, and the ratios that make up the human body. Like 7 heads to one height is like, a generic male torso. And so when that came along, it was, to me, just a really great opportunity. And yeah, I've continued to produce. I did carve my life size in marble. I did produce that in some Italian statuary. I got that from Dan Sinclair at DMS Studios when he was retiring in New York. So I got a really nice piece of Italian marble, and I carved tool. And so I ended up succeeding in that manifestation. From there, most of my figurative work has been in portraiture since then. And I still do that. I even have one that's on my bench now. I work it pretty slow these days. It takes me, with the business and everything else that I have on my plate, it might take me 3 years to actually produce one portrait at this point, but I still do it.
I'm looking at your sculpture portfolio now, and I like all the stuff. We'll put the website we'll put that on that's on stonecarversguild.com already. But it's bouskaart.com. It's very cool. I think that you've underpriced this lion's head. You only have it listed for $1,800, and it's really, really nice.
Well, it's plaster.
Oh, it's plaster. Oh, okay.
It's carved.
Okay, fair.
The material was cheap.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right. So you can make multiple copies of it.
I could. I would need to mold that one, which I can do. I'm a decent mold maker.
I really like the energy of it. It's pretty cool.
That piece has gotten a great reception, and oddly enough, it's I've had people tell me that kind of looks like me. I think it's the long nose or something. I don't know, but I wasn't an intentional thing, but I had a couple of people say that looks almost like a self-portrait. And I'm like, okay.
Well, you used to, the first time I met you, you had a big mane of hair. It looks like that you've changed that, but the first time I met you, you had a pretty wild mane. So maybe that's what
I think so. Yeah. Especially at that point too. I had some longer hair going on. The older you get, the thinner it gets. And that's kind of where the phase I'm entering now. I have a full head of hair, but I am not 22 anymore. So it's pretty short right now. It's like a buzz cut at the moment, but that's, it's easy to take care of. I had a braid. It went down to the middle of my back for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years there at some point.
Yeah, the temperature spiked about 2 weeks ago, and I got out my buzz cutters, and it's just like, never mind, I'm not going to worry about this hair. So I cut it all down to about 1/4 of an inch, to the chagrin of my wife.
So, Stephen, you said you're kind of in the doing phase of your practice. Can you give us a sense of what that looks like on the day-to-day? What are the projects that you're working on, and what do you look forward to in the future?
Well, so I'm operating my stone carving studio. I go under the DBA of old world stone design. Doesn't match my website. My name was better for that one, but being a business owner, there's logistics to that. So I do 1 day a week, pretty much is just office and logistics. So I do bookkeeping, I do accounting, invoicing, paperwork, payables, sometimes setting up insurances, renewing insurances. There's a lot of paperwork involved with having any kind of a business, and it takes a substantial amount of time to do that. Consultations, reaching out to people and developing conversations, anything that seems like it needs my attention and is necessary for the mechanical aspects of being a business owner. I'm licensed, I'm insured here in the state of California as much as they require. I have a contractor's license. I have a contractor's license in both tile, mosaic installation, and also masonry. All of that stuff needs maintenance. Outside of that, there's the mechanical side of things. The work truck, it needs oil changes. Sometimes it needs brake pads. Sometimes the forklift has problems. Things break down. Developing ideas. I just bid on a ramp and twist stairway that is in potentially Indiana limestone. If it goes through, I got a pretty positive reception, at least out of the earlier part of the process. That can take weeks to actually return back to me if something does manifest from that. But even going through and just doing the takeoffs from the plans and measuring it and getting my dimensions and calculations from that, you need to know how much cubic stone do I need to buy? What kind of a cut list am I going to create from that? And so that's kind of part of it. Then there's the getting on the tools part of it, which that ranges, like right now I have a monument in the shop it's Tennessee marble. It's kind of interesting. It's in the earlier phases still, but it has some roses that's going to get carved in there. It's kind of a classical design. I would say maybe like an Ionic vibe to it a little bit, but the roses are really, the main focus of any of the artistries on there. And I want them to look fairly realistic. And I have them pretty much pointed in at this stage. where that one required creating a model. So I created a wood armature, and I sculpted the roses in clay, and I've been transferring those into that block of marble. My studio, I'm here to help produce artwork for other people. So there's artists that will come to my studio. For instance, there's Richard Walker, who does these conceptual designs, where he has stone pieces integrated with photography and hanging pieces and interesting installations with neon and other stuff. And I will help create his pieces. And then there's a big one right now that's, I would call it kind of a Noguchi-esque idea. Basically, I'm taking these forms, these larger boulders, and I'm just processing them down into these refined shapes where it's like the ocean. The concept is that the ocean has taken these rocks and smashed them against the shoreline so many different times that it's smoothed them and battered them into these different surfaces. And there's 8 of these that we've been producing of different sizes and configurations. Some are quite large, some are a little more like plates that will be coming up, but that's kind of in play. There's some masonry that just went through, and that those boulders were all like local California granites. There's some there's a house here in Folsom. I love Texas limestone. It's basically my standard stone for the shop. I have stockpiles of it here, and if anybody has a carving project, that's usually where I start out.
Do you all of the limestones, or one in particular?
If it was the most popular one out here is bottom ledge cream. It's just got colors and everything else, but as far as durability goes, I think carving wise, Luder's is beautiful.
Yeah,
I
I think so too.
Quite a bit.
It's got a ledge limitation, which is unfortunate.
Yeah. Some of those I came across something like that before with I needed to do some plinth blocks for it, and I was trying to get some pieces that were like 24 inches, and they were just saying, no, we don't have those.
Yeah.
That you're going to have to do something different with that. The length was fine, but getting that bed height out of it was
right. I think the usable bed is, everybody says something different, but I always just cap it at 14. I don't ever try to get more than 14.
It sounds like Stephen has a lot of experience with different stones. It might be fun sometime to do a podcast that's like a materials podcast. Because
you mean like get a group of guild members together?
Either just Stephen or like some of the terms that you guys have used. Well, I don't know what they mean, but I'm sure a lot of our listeners don't. Like you mentioned Spalding, I think, with sandstone. Anyway, it'd be really interesting sometime, like just to go into that area of your expertise, Stephen, and talk about materials and, like you just mentioned, a particular type of Texas limestone. I didn't know there were different types. I suppose if you think about it, it makes sense, but like that's a rabbit hole that we could go down pretty deep, and that would be pretty fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and I think, so we touched on this earlier about the weatherability of some of these stones. So what project you have is also, it's really important to choose and to try to utilize a stone that is suitable for that purpose. Granite is incredibly durable. If you want something that's going to stay outside and last for millennia, that is an excellent stone. It's really tough to carve, and a lot of times, depending on even which granite, you're going to have a really tough time getting an edge out of it, and it robs color. The chiaroscuro that you're going to get from that, it's not going to glow like, for instance, an Italian marble. But Italian marbles, as beautiful as they are, or any marble, really, in general, are susceptible to acids. which with industrialization and acid rain causes weathering in the outdoors. They gradually dissolve outside. And so there's a lifespan to the exterior, or like with the sandstone we talked about, the clay is water soluble, but the iron isn't. And so if you choose one sandstone compared to another sandstone, they're not going to have the same life outside. And this can't be dramatically fast. I mean, there's a science behind some of this stuff that you have to be aware of. Like sealing limestone in an exterior could actually be bad. You know.
Oh yeah, for sure.
You don't want to do that. That can cause spalling because
you want it to breathe, right? I mean,
yes,
yeah.
I've seen this happen too. It's not good. The sealer crust always stays hard because it never gets soft with the water, but the stone underneath it gets soft, and then it freezes, and then the hard layer pops off, and then everybody's concerned why their stone's destroyed.
Is that true for like those, you know, they have those sacrificial graffiti protective coats that I went round and round with the University of Texas trying to get them to not put that on to some stuff that I did for them. Do you know, Stephen, if that's something is that also does it create that same layer of rigid surface?
Short answer, I would think, is yes.
Yeah, that's what
I think, you know, like stones, every sealer is going to be different. You know, maybe one sealer, maybe it's a feeble sealer, and by luck, it's feeble enough to where the stone can somehow endure it. It would require testing. Really, it needs to be a sort of thing where there's a sample and it weathers outside for an entire thermal cycle. I mean, you have to seal one of these stones, seal 10 stones with 10 different sealers and have them outside through that process. This is what the university should do if they want to have the absolute safest path forward. If they just have to have a sealer, which I agree with you, I would just say, let it be.
Yeah, I kind of like let it roll, you know, if people want to paint it, let them paint it. Hey, we're kind of pushing up on the hour. We should probably, but obviously we need to have you back, Stephen, because it sounds like we only got about scratch the surface of all of the stuff that you know and experiences that you've had. Thank you so much for
we really appreciate it.
Us.
Yeah, fantastic.
I'm delighted. This has been a lot of fun. I mean, you get me jabbering. I do enjoy it.
That's perfect for podcasting.
Yeah. We really
makes our job so easy.
Yeah, thanks so much, Stephen.
You're welcome.
You've been listening to the Stone Carvers Guild podcast. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you will find us online at stonecarversguild.org. There you can find photos showing some of the things that we discussed today, additional information about our guest, and if you're so inclined, ways to get more involved with the Guild and our ongoing activities. And of course, if you've enjoyed this podcast, we hope that you will subscribe and rate us on the podcaster of your choice. 5 stars, please. We'll be back in a month with a new episode, so until then, keep your hammer up and your chisel sharp.